To jump straight back in and continue reading from the article, Psychiatry and the Presumption of Expertise, Flipping Coins in the Courtroom by Bruce Innes and Thomas Litwack. Again, this 1974 article provides a broad overview of the state of psychiatry prior to the supposed revolutionization of the field that was ushered in by the publication of the third edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM-III, in 1980. Starting back with Section B, the Validity of Psychiatric Judgments, from Part 1, Professional Literature on the Reliability and Validity of Psychiatric Judgments. It may be useful to note again that there are at least 4 kinds of psychiatric judgments that may be relevant in a civil commitment proceeding. Is the prospective patient mentally ill? Is he dangerous? Does his condition require involuntary hospitalization and treatment? And will involuntary hospitalization and treatment cure or benefit the prospective patient? There are very few studies of the validity of psychiatric judgments in the first, third, and fourth areas. There are more studies of the validity of psychiatric judgments of dangerousness. We will discuss those studies in a moment. Subsection 1, the validity of diagnosis. Although there are comparatively few studies of the validity of psychiatric diagnoses, the studies discussed above which indicate that such diagnoses are of limited reliability also suggest that they may be of limited validity. And the rate of validity may depend on the use to which these judgments are put. For example, a diagnosis of psychosis may accurately describe qualities the diagnosticians perceived in a patient, and may less accurately describe qualities the patient objectively manifested. And it may predict with no accuracy at all whether the patient is dangerous, requires hospitalization, or will benefit from treatment. Nevertheless, the few studies that do exist suggest that diagnostic validity is quite low. In a comprehensive research project, Nathan and his coworkers compared the diagnoses given to hospital patients with the symptoms and behaviors recorded by the diagnosticians themselves, thus avoiding the issue of whether a particular symptom or behavior was indeed present. The authors sought to determine whether the diagnoses followed logically and consistently from the recorded perceptions of behavior. In other words, whether the diagnoses followed the relatively standardized rules for making evaluative judgments based on the presence or absence of various symptoms and behaviors. Even under these controlled conditions, the authors found that diagnoses had only limited validity. They discovered that the diagnosis of psychosis generally was arrived at only when the examiner had recorded the presence of one or more of a small group of symptoms, such as hallucinations, delusions, lack of reality testing, disordered thought processes, or autistic behavior that are associated with psychosis. On the other hand, more specific diagnoses, such as paranoid schizophrenia or hysterical neurosis, were applied even when the examiner had not recorded evidence of one or more symptoms or behaviors supposedly associated with that specific diagnosis. In short, most specific diagnoses do not accurately describe even those symptoms perceived by the examiner, to say nothing of the actual symptoms exhibited by the patient. And there is a footnote worth reading here as well. It will never be possible to assess the validity of psychiatric diagnoses until it is first proved that there are such things as schizophrenia or manic depressive psychosis. On the other hand, if a diagnostic label is merely a shorthand way of describing the presence of certain symptoms, then it should be possible to assess the correspondence between a diagnosis and the presence of symptoms which, by definition, are associated with that diagnosis. Thus, if schizophrenic persons are supposed to exhibit symptoms X, Y, and Z, and if a person with none of those symptoms is diagnosed as schizophrenic, we could say that particular diagnosis is invalid. It is validity in this more limited sense with which we are concerned here, even in this qualified sense. However, it is difficult to assess the validity of psychiatric diagnoses. First, because there is no general agreement on the irreducible minimum of symptoms required for each diagnosis. And second, because the symptoms themselves are often so vague or subjective, poor judgment, inappropriate affect, and so forth, that it is impossible to measure the correspondence between such an ephemeral symptom in the diagnostic category. Back to the main body of the article. Similarly, Zubin cites several studies which conclude that there is little or no relationship between diagnosis and symptomatology. Rather, there appears to be considerable overlapping of symptoms between diagnostic categories, and within a diagnostic category, there is considerable variability of symptomatology. In another study of diagnostic validity, Goldsmith and Mendel selected 34 relatively complete psychodynamic formulations from 336 inpatient records of a psychiatric hospital. The formulations described the patient's history, emotions, and motivations in some detail. Each patient originally had been designated as falling within one of 7 diagnoses. Psychiatrists and laymen then were asked to study the formulations and to predict the assigned diagnoses. The objective was to determine the extent to which the symptoms and behavior identified in the formulations would enable test participants to reach the same diagnoses. The authors found that the psychiatrists predicted the assigned diagnoses only slightly more often than chance would dictate. More important, there was no significant difference in the accuracy of the diagnostic predictions made by the psychiatrist and those made by laymen. Since diagnoses are supposed to reflect overt behavior, the study suggests that psychiatrists cannot validly predict behavior from their understanding of the patient's emotional and motivational structure and history. On the basis of an exhaustive review of the literature, Frank observed that, save for perhaps the grossest kind of psychotic behavior, there were few, if any, correlations between diagnoses and patterns of behavior. He concluded that these data seem to point to the lack of validity of this mode of classifying behavior and questions the usefulness of diagnosis. Another authority, after noting that many clinicians are unable to make better than chance judgments, concludes that we can no longer take for granted the validity of any clinician's judgment. Subsection 2. The validity of predictions of dangerousness. Perhaps the most important judgment psychiatrists make is whether or not an individual is dangerous. Approximately 50,000 mentally ill persons per year are predicted to be dangerous and preventatively detained. In addition, about 5% of the total mental hospital population of the United States are kept in maximum security sections on assessment of their potential dangerousness. And here I am going to switch focus, and this is explicitly to point out how relevant this article from 1974 still is to this day. Study finds involuntary psychiatric detentions on the rise. Americans are increasingly being detained as a danger to themselves or others because of mental illness. And this is from UCLA Newsroom by Les Dunseth. The rate at which Americans are held against their will and forced to undergo mental health evaluations and even state-ordered confinement, lasting anywhere from a few days to years, has risen sharply over the past decade, according to a new study by researchers at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs. Unfortunately, this study is currently behind a paywall. The study is the most comprehensive compilation of data on involuntary detentions to date. The researchers say an undertaking made more challenging by the lack of a national data set on the topic and long-standing inconsistencies in reporting across states and jurisdictions. This is the most controversial intervention in mental health. You're deprived of liberty, can be traumatized, and then stigmatized. Yet no one could tell how often it happens in the United States, said David Cohen. Cohen and his co-lead author G. Lee, a social welfare doctoral student at the Luskin School, scoured health and court websites for all U.S. states and were able to cull usable counts on emergency and long-term involuntary detentions from just 25 of them for the period from 2011 to 2018. In those 25 states, they found annual detentions varied from a low of 29 per 100,000 people in Connecticut in 2015 to a high of 966 in Florida in 2018. 22 of those states had continuous data from 2012 to 2016, and the authors found that during the 5-year span, the average yearly detention rate in these states increased by 13%. While their average population grew by just 4%, the authors say. Further, using data from 24 states that make up 52% of the country's population, the researchers calculated a rate of 357 emergency involuntary detentions per 100,000 people in 2014, a total of 591,000 detentions. And just to emphasize, this is a significantly larger number than cited by Innes and Litwack in 1974, when the state mental hospitals were in full force. If you think that coercion is necessary in mental health, then a rise in detention rates may become welcome news, a sign that society is doing whatever it takes to help people in crisis and keep order, Cohen said. But if you think that coercion is punishment, that we need services to prevent or diffuse crises in families and society before they get out of control, then a rise is a bad sign. Indeed, Cohen hints at the possibility that involuntary psychiatric detention might increase the risk of suicide, which seems a distinct possibility given that it is accompanied by being strip-searched, restrained, secluded, having drugs forced on you, losing your credibility. As Cohen adds, for people already scarred by traumatic events, an involuntary detention can be another trauma. As Innes and Litwack continue 50 years prior. There is evidence that the perception of dangerousness is the single most important determinant of judicial decisions to commit individuals or to release patients requesting discharge from a hospital. Psychiatrists commonly testify at civil commitment proceedings that a given individual is dangerous to himself or others. How valid are these predictions? First, let us consider the research results on dangerousness to others. In early 1969, Dershowitz reviewed the few studies in the literature on the prediction of antisocial conduct and concluded that psychiatrists are rather inaccurate predictors, inaccurate in an absolute sense, and even less accurate when compared with other professionals such as psychologists, social workers, and correctional officials, and when compared to actuarial devices such as prediction or experience tables. Even more significant for legal purposes, it seems that psychiatrists are particularly prone to one type of error: over-prediction. They tend to predict antisocial conduct in many instances where it would not, in fact, occur. Indeed, our research suggests that for every correct psychiatric prediction of violence, there are numerous erroneous predictions. That is, among every group of inmates presently confined on the basis of psychiatric predictions of violence, there are only a few who would, and many more who would not, actually engage in such conduct if released. Perhaps the most striking evidence supporting Dershowitz's conclusions comes from the study of the results of Operation Backstrom, involving 969 prisoner patients in New York State who were affected by the Supreme Court's decision in Backstrom v. Herald. In Backstrom v. Herald, the court held that those persons remaining in Department of Corrections hospitals after their prison terms had expired must be released, and committed civilly, if at all. Each of the 969 patients had been detained in maximum security hospitals because psychiatrists determined that they were mentally ill and too dangerous for release or even for transfer to civil hospitals. Nevertheless, 1 year after the patients were transferred to civil hospitals, 147 had been discharged to the community, and the 702 who remained were found to present no special problems to the hospital staff. Only 7 patients were found to be so difficult to manage or so dangerous as to require recommitment to a Department of Corrections hospital. Several years later, 27% of the patients were living in the community. Only 9 had been convicted of a crime, only 2 of felonies, and only 3% were in a correctional facility or hospital for the criminally insane. As one of the authors has written elsewhere, in statistical terms, Operation Backstrom tells us that psychiatric predictions are incredibly inaccurate. In human terms, it tells us that but for a Supreme Court decision, nearly 1,000 human beings would have lived much of their lives behind bars, without grounds privileges, without home visits, without even the limited amenities available to civil patients, all because a few psychiatrists, in their considered opinion, thought they were dangerous and no one asked for proof. One psychiatrist has noted that there is no empirical support for the belief that psychiatrists can predict dangerous behavior. To the contrary, even with the most careful, painstaking, laborious, and lengthy clinical approach to the prediction of dangerousness, false positives may be at a minimum of 60 to 70%. In other words, even under controlled conditions, at least 60 to 70% of the people whom psychiatrists judge to be dangerous may, in fact, be harmless. Similarly, another psychiatrist acknowledges that psychiatrists cannot predict with even reasonable certainty that an individual will be dangerous to himself or others. Monahan summarized his review of the most recent literature on the prediction of violence as follows. The conclusion to emerge most strikingly from these studies is the great degree to which violence is over-predicted. Of those predicted to be dangerous, between 65% and 95% are false positives, people who will not, in fact, commit a dangerous act. Indeed, the literature has been consistent on this point ever since Pinel took the chains off the supposedly dangerous mental patients at La Bicêtre in 1792. And sorry, I am not that great with French pronunciations, even with preparation. And the resulting lack of violence gave lie to the psychiatric predictions which justified their restraint. Violence is vastly over-predicted, whether simple behavioral indicators are used or sophisticated, multivariate analyses are employed. and whether psychological tests are administered or thorough psychiatric examinations are performed. It is also noteworthy that the population used in recent studies was highly selective and biased towards positive results, primarily convicted offenders, sexual psychopaths, and adjudicated delinquents. The fact that even in these groups, with higher base rates for violence than the general population violence cannot be validly predicted bodes very poorly for predicting violence among those who have not committed a criminal act. Finally, there is no support in the literature for the popularly held notion that the mentally ill are more dangerous as a group than the general population, or for any belief that the presence of a psychiatric disturbance per se makes the prediction of violence easier and more accurate than would otherwise be the case. The studies discussed thus far are, for the most part, studies of the validity of predictions of danger to others. There are, in addition, numerous studies of the validity of predictions of danger to self. Writing in 1972, Murphy concluded that prediction of the infrequent event of suicide is poor. It would be very much poorer in a population unselected for risk. The development of predictive tools of high accuracy has not yet been achieved, not even for populations with high risk of suicide, of which suicide attempters are but one example. An even more recent and comprehensive review of the literature by Greenberg concludes that a method for distinguishing persons who will suicide from those who will not, with a measure of accuracy sufficiently high to permit its use in psychiatric commitments, simply does not exist at present. Subsection 3. The validity of predictions of the need for hospitalization and treatment. Psychiatrists frequently predict whether a person's condition requires hospitalization or treatment. That is, they often predict whether a person will be able to get along outside a hospital. Again, there are very few studies of the validity of such predictions. It is difficult to conduct such studies because once the psychiatrist predicts that the individual will not be able to get along in the community, the individual is usually hospitalized, denying researchers the opportunity to determine whether the prediction was right or wrong. In one relevant study, Rapport, Lawson, and Grunwald studied 73 patients who requested court hearings to obtain release from a psychiatric hospital. Their psychiatrists felt they were not suitable for release. Of the 73, 26 were released by the courts, despite the objections of their psychiatrists, and 47 were remanded to the hospital. 12 of the 47 subsequently escaped. The investigation studied the community adjustment of these 38 individuals after at least 1 year. Notably, 44% of the court released and 42% of the escaped patients made a satisfactory adjustment to the community. They had not been in serious trouble with the law, had not been rehospitalized, and were caring for themselves. Of equal significance, in neither group did any serious antisocial behavior occur, although a number of the patients who did not adjust were involved in minor accidents or crimes. Since these rates of adjustment compared favorably with those obtained in studies of patients released on the recommendation of psychiatrists, and since the courts here acted contrary to the opinions of psychiatrists in what were presumably difficult cases, the investigators concluded that the courts may be considered to have a better prediction rate than psychiatrists, since they released patients that otherwise would not have been released at that time. There are also a few studies that are less directly on point but are still suggestive. The details vary from study to study, but the essential points are similar. In each study, individuals who had been examined in a hospital admission ward and found to require full-time hospitalization and treatment were randomly divided into two groups. One group was hospitalized and the other was treated in the community or in a day hospital on an outpatient basis. Over a substantial period of time, only a few of the community patients failed to get along in the community and had to be hospitalized. In fact, the community patients recovered faster than the hospitalized patients and cost the state half as much money. Who could have ever possibly thought that patients might recover faster if they are not locked away and treated like prisoners? Subsection 4. The validity of predictions of the effect of hospitalization and treatment. Whether a prospective patient will respond favorably or unfavorably to hospitalization and treatment should be a central issue in every commitment proceeding. Unfortunately, it is not. Once again, we find that there are very few studies of the validity of psychiatric predictions of the probable outcome, the prognosis of hospitalization and treatment. Robbins and Goose surveyed the literature concerning the validity of clinicians' judgments of the prognosis of schizophrenic patients. They found considerable variation between the predicted prognoses and the actual outcomes of treatment. In practice, patients who received a poor prognosis did poorly as infrequently as 55% of the time in one study and as frequently as 91% of the time in another. In contrast, patients with a good prognosis did well as frequently as 83% of the time in one study and as infrequently as 36% in another. Other investigations show that psychiatrists accurately predicted the beneficial or non-beneficial effect of electroshock therapy. For several hundred patients, only 41% of the time. In other words, their predictions would have been more valid if they had been based on the flip of a coin. The studies discussed in Part 1 indicate that psychiatrists often disagree in their judgments, and that even when they do agree, those judgments, especially predictive judgments, are often wrong. In particular, psychiatric predictions that an individual is dangerous are usually wrong. Furthermore, perceptions of symptoms and behavior vary dramatically among examining psychiatrists, and for some diagnostic categories, there is little relationship between the symptoms and behavior perceived by the psychiatrist and the eventual diagnosis. For specific diagnostic categories, there is little evidence that the symptoms and behavior perceived by the psychiatrist were actually exhibited by the patient. Accordingly, a diagnosis often suggests that a patient has exhibited certain symptoms or behavior which he or she did not in fact exhibit. In short, diagnoses often convey more inaccurate than accurate information about patients. And I will stop here from now, picking up next time at Part 2, Reasons Why Psychiatric Judgments Are Unreliable and Invalid. I hope to see you there.